Okay, so once these trees get bitten, they get sick. Their fruit are unusable. They have to be destroyed. So hundreds of thousands of trees have been destroyed in Florida alone due to this disease. And this is a disease that it turns out it's very difficult to confer resistance using traditional breeding techniques, which would typically be a graft. But in order to do that, you need a plant that's resistant, that's closely related enough to this, in this case, orange tree. There's no such plant. So genetic engineering is a potential way to address this problem. You could confer some resistance to the bacterium or some resistance to the insect that transmits it by inserting a gene into the genome of this citrus plant. Here's another example. Some of you may be familiar with this kind of funky looking rice here. It has this kind of orangish color. This is so-called golden rice. So golden rice contains more beta carotene, that's a precursor of vitamin A, than standard rice does. So it's been genetically altered in order to produce more beta carotene. Why is that important? Because in the developing world, vitamin A deficiency is actually a huge problem. In children, it can actually be lethal. In adults, it's merely extremely debilitating. These are parts of the world where supplementation or getting people vitamin A through other means, like, for example, fresh fruits and vegetables, turns out to be difficult just because of the logistic challenges of transporting and storing stuff there. So one thought is, you can give people the staple crop that they're growing anyway in these regions, and it can just supply, as they're eating the staple crop, some of the vitamin A that they need. Now, I should say this is still under development. There's some concerns about yield, about would it actually provide people enough vitamin A to be useful? These are kind of like technical challenges, so I don't want to tout this as a silver bullet or anything, but this is just a kind of idea of the sorts of things that you might be able to accomplish using genetic engineering techniques. Now, when I talk about this stuff, the primary concern that people raise is typically around safety. So specifically, is it really safe for people to consume this stuff? Are there maybe risks that we should be aware of? And there's a pretty clear scientific consensus that there aren't any risks to genetically engineered foods above and beyond the risks in conventional agriculture. So that's a kind of a carefully parsed statement, which just reflects the fact that nothing is risk-free, right? So yeah, you can make something toxic with genetic engineering. You can also make something toxic with conventional breeding. So I'm showing here just an excerpt from a statement from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which you guys are probably familiar with, this organization. I could have shown you lots of other, right? So there's a kind of a broad scientific consensus around this, that it is safe to eat GE foods. Let me just check the chat here. It's sort of popping down in a way that makes me think that somebody might be asking questions. Julia Minson points out it's weird sharing an experience with 277 colleagues, but not knowing who they are or being able to see them. For you and me both, Julia. Okay, so as I was saying, there's a scientific consensus around this stuff. That's quite broad, and it's, as we can see on this next slide, kind of comparable to the consensus among scientists that we have around global warming. So what I'm showing you here is a Pew Research poll that was conducted in 2015, and they polled members of the AAAS, so these are all working scientists, and they also polled randomly selected sample of the US public, and they asked them agree or disagree with these different statements here. And here I'm showing the US adults in blue, and I'm showing the scientists in red, right? And so the length of the line here reflects the size of the gap between the scientific consensus and what the lay people think. And you can see that for some things, there's actually quite a bit of agreement between scientists and the public. So has the space station been a good investment for the US? Most scientists, well, yeah, the majority of scientists and lay people agree with that. You start seeing bigger gaps here around a topic that's been in the news a lot, namely vaccines. So here scientists are more likely to say we should be requiring these childhood vaccines than adults are. For these in the US heavily politicized issues around have humans evolved from other animals and climate change, these are obviously issues where you see a big partisan divide. Here we start to see bigger gaps between the scientific opinion and the lay opinion here. So these gaps start to get bigger. You see the biggest gap of all, though, on whether it's safe to eat GE foods. So here you can see that that's a statement that 88% of scientists agree with, which, just for comparison, 87% of scientists agree that climate change is mostly due to human activity. So I would say pretty broad consensus among the scientists there, but that's actually a minority opinion among the public. So that's kind of a remarkable fact. And so people have been asking for a while, why should that be the case? And there's been a lot of research about this. And most of this research has focused on people's risk-benefit beliefs, right? So the idea being that people have different beliefs about risks and benefits that scientists do, and that leads them to have different opinions. So in fact, lay people do seem to think that GE food is riskier and less beneficial than scientists do. And those beliefs do seem to be correlated, at least, with their attitudes towards GE food in general, like their desire to ban it, for example. So that would seem to be on its face pretty decent evidence that risk and benefit beliefs are playing a role here. But there's a sort of a peculiar thing, which I'll return to a little bit later, which is that, if this were the case, you would expect people to respond to information about risks and benefits. And there's been a number of studies done, carefully done, large N studies, where it seems like people just don't, right? So if their beliefs about GE food are being driven by risks and benefits, you would think that informing them would change their opinions, and it doesn't really seem to, right? So that's a bit of a problem for this theory, that risk-benefit beliefs are primary. So Sydney and Paul and I, we were thinking about this issue, and we thought, well, maybe this research to date has been missing something. So maybe for some people, rather than a matter of reasoned calculation about risks and benefits, this might be a moral issue. And in particular, we thought that some people might have what are called deontic moral values. This is, in the literature, these have gone by kind of different names. Barron and Spronka called them protected values. Tetlock and colleagues called them sacred values. And these definitions, they differ a little bit in the details, but basically, these are values where people hold, or at least profess to hold, an unconditional prohibition on a certain action, right? And the prohibition says, don't do this no matter what. And so our thinking was, some people may have these sorts of categorical objections to GE food based on some other moral or non-moral intuition. So for example, that GE food is unnatural, impure, or contaminating, and that the reasoning about risks and benefits may be beside the point here, right? And so that might be why when you give people risk-benefit information, they don't seem particularly responsive to it. So this is the idea here that we set out to test. This is a study, the one study that I'm going to show you here that's actually published. And I'm just going to check the chat to make sure there's nothing going on there. And there's not. Hooray. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the one published study. And what we did is we looked at a representative sample of US adults. These were recruited by Qualtrics, and they were quota weighted to be representative of the US population in age, gender, and income. We, on the basis of some questions that we drew from the literature that I'll show you in a minute, we tried to classify them as either unopposed, so these are people who are okay with genetic engineering, non-absolutist opponents. So these are people who are opponents of genetic engineering, but who are doing so in the kind of traditional risk-benefit way that research so far has thought of everybody as doing it this way. And then we thought there might be a third group, which we called absolutist opponents. You'll see just why we did that in a second when you see the questions. But basically, these were people we thought might have a moral prohibition against GE, right? So you could think of this as a sacred or a protected value that says, well, don't do this. Okay, so how did we actually do this? We asked them a series of agree, disagree questions about the genetic engineering of plants and animals. I'm going to show you actually just a subset of the items that we use to operationalize absolutist opposition. We've done robustness checks that look at other items as well, so it's not dependent on this one particular item. Just this one, I think, is the kind of clearest from a just face validity content perspective. But if you'd like to hear all about the other items we looked at as well, you can check out the supplement of that paper. Okay, so here are the people who are unopposed, who say, I don't oppose this. Okay, that's pretty obvious. What about the non-absolutist opponents? So just keep in mind they can answer yes or no to any of these questions, right? The non-absolutist opponents, so they don't agree, I do not oppose this. And I should say, this double negative, it's not awesome. We did it that way because we wanted to stick as closely as possible to the Baron Bronco paper we drew these items from, and that's how they did it. It does confuse some folks. So in later iterations of the study, we've gotten rid of that double negative, and it just slightly reduces the percentage of people who give inconsistent responses. Anyway, your non-absolutist opponents, they're the people who don't agree with this, right? So they are opposed, but they don't agree with this either, right? So they don't think it should be prohibited no matter what. Now, finally, our absolutist opponents are the people who say this should be prohibited no matter how great the benefits and minor the risks, right? And they're also not checking this box to say that they're unopposed.
Yeah, well, this is Jeff. Just wanted to ask a question here.
Yeah.
Did you always group plants and animals together when asking this question? I could imagine people might have different levels of opposition if you broke it down. Like the idea of a sort of hybrid animal seems particularly horrifying, but the idea of, a drought-resistant crop seems quite a bit less so. I'm just sort of curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I know, we always asked about plants and animals together. Sydney, do you know if we ever ran it with plants only?
Yeah, so I do think we always asked about engineering plants and animals for human consumption. When we look at some other data, people are more opposed to engineering animals than plants, but they're also just generally, the big effect is that they're very opposed to engineering overall, regardless of sort of the details. Mm-hmm. And I imagine they would also be very upset with the hybrid, Jeff, though I've never asked that.
Right.
Right. Yeah, Jeff, that's a great question. My expectation is, we would see it go down a little bit if we asked about just plants alone. So let's have a look at the results here from this sample. Keep in mind, these are a quota sample of Americans here. So we have 36% unopposed. We have 18.5% non-absolutist opponents, and then the remainder are absolutist opponents. And so that's a plurality of our respondents overall. It's getting close to just an outright majority of the sample. This might look extreme to you because it's a pretty extreme statement. As we'll see in a minute, the Europeans are even more extreme here. So we were also interested in the role that disgust might play in this kind of opposition, because oops, Q&A is popping up. Okay, I will let the moderators handle that because it looks complicated. Okay, and I'm gonna make this go away. So disgust, we thought, whoops, might be relevant here for a couple reasons. Disgust is a very old emotion that evolved really to keep us from coming into contact with things that were dangerous, that might contain pathogens or toxins. And it really has to do, originally it's thought with oral incorporation, right? Like keeping something out of the body that's bad for you. But it's extended to be associated with reactions to things that are seen as impure or unnatural. And so it seems sort of a natural candidate for a moral objection to something that you eat. So what we did is we asked people to consider some scenarios and to consider people who eat genetically modified foods. So here's one representative example. Here's Mary eating these genetically modified tomatoes, which she does knowingly. And scientists have done this for this reason. We always give a reason here. So among other things, we ask people, how disgusted are you when imagining this situation? And we had 4 scenarios in all. 2 were plants, tomatoes and apples, and 2 were animal products or animals themselves, tuna and milk. And those are quite highly correlated, so we're just averaging them together. Now, if I remember correctly, discuss ratings here were a little bit higher for the animal than for the plant scenarios, which is sort of supportive of the point that Jeff was just making, that animals are even worse. Looking at all of these together, this is the composite average discussed rating across the 4 scenarios, and I'm breaking this up by is the respondent unopposed, a non-absolutist opponent, or an absolutist opponent, and you can see that these get significantly higher at each category. And these are sizable effects. So if we look at the effect size here, absolutist versus unopposed, what have we got here? Yeah, this is a D of 1.5, this difference here. Absolutist versus non-absolutist opponent is still a D of around 0.5. So there seems to be quite a lot of disgust involved here, particularly for these absolutist folks. This is, again, this is a 9-point scale, right? So they're like at the midpoint for this person is just sitting there eating an apple. So that's like kind of remarkable. We also looked at disgust sensitivity, reasoning that this is an individual difference measure, just of how readily disgusted are people. This is using the disgust scale revised, which is sort of a standard measure of that. And our reasoning here was people who are more readily disgusted, they might be more prone to looking at genetically engineered food as something immoral or bad if it pushes those disgust buttons for them, right? So they're more attuned to things that might be gross or contaminating. Therefore, this practice, which to some people might seem that way, is going to be more objectionable to them. And here, these are standard deviations again. Now this looks smaller, but these are still in terms of pre-sizable effects. So if you compare, whoops, where's my pointer? Compare this condition, this group versus this group, that's a D of 0.68 between the unopposed and the absolutist. Just look at the absolutist versus non-absolutist opponents, it's a D of 0.3, right? And just this is an individual difference measure that's meant to tap this like fairly basic difference between people, right? So we're not asking them here specifically about GE food or anything like that. So I mentioned we had some comparative data for Europe as well. So these are new samples here from the United States, France, and Germany. These again are Qualtrics quota samples that are representative of the nation from which they're drawn on age, gender, and income. And here we see basically a replication of our US results with even a little more absolutist opposition here. So now they're the outright majority of the sample are absolutist opponents, but if you look at Germany and then you look at France, they look even more extreme, right? So that's really kind of, especially in France, kind of the overwhelming majority are absolutist opponents here. Okay.
Yoel, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we've discussed this a little bit before, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what's going on in the minds of participants who select the absolutist option. For example, do you think this is a true position? Is it posturing? Is this a way to express a strong attitude? What do you think is really being captured here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is very pertinent to the next section that I have, which is about can we change these people's attitudes, right? So I don't think anybody who works in this area, so who's done research on protected values or sacred values, thinks that people mean this literally, right? So I think John Barron called these strong opinions weakly held, right? So people, in my view, are expressing a moral stance. And they are expressing that in an extreme way, but that doesn't mean that they can't be swayed. It does mean, in my opinion, that certain kinds of appeals are going to be more likely to persuade them than others, right? So once you know that somebody has moralized this belief, that kind of informs you about what sort of information they might be willing to respond to versus not. Does that make sense? I'm going to assume yes, because
yes, definitely. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. All right, right. So what we were interested in pursuing in this follow-up work was like, well, can we get these people to change their minds, right? So if you look at these results that I've shown so far in kind of like the most simplistic possible way, you might think like, oh, there's no way that we can ever change people's minds about this stuff. And I just don't think that's right, right? I think that when people are expressing these absolutist opinions, they're telling us something meaningful, that they're moralizing this, but that doesn't mean that we can't sway them. Now, one thing that people have often thought, as I kind of alluded to briefly earlier, is that you just tell people about the scientific consensus. That should change their minds, right? And one basis for thinking so is that people, they really don't know a lot about this stuff, right? So informing them arguably should make them better, right? So when I say they don't know a lot, what I mean, I'm going to show you some representative data here. This is just Americans, but we have data on Europeans too, and they really don't look much better than the Americans do before any Europeans in the audience start getting too smug about this. So we asked people some true-false questions about genetic engineering. So for example, is it true or false that ordinary tomatoes do not contain genes while genetically modified tomatoes do? I'm going to resist the temptation to have you guys vote on the right answer. I'll just show you what people said. So here's the percentage of people who got that question right. And obviously the correct answer to that would be, that's not true. All tomatoes contain genes, right? Less than half got that one right. Genetically modified animals are always bigger than ordinary ones. 42% got that right. Here's the most intense one to me. Eating a GM fruit could modify your own genes. Here, at least more than half are getting this right, which is possibly somewhat reassuring, right? So, okay, takeaway here is people just don't know a lot about this stuff, right? So one natural way to kind of change people's attitudes is to say, well, you know, people are kind of in a state of ignorance. Why don't we tell them about the scientific consensus about the risks and benefits of this stuff? And when it's been tried, it's sort of uniformly been the case that it hasn't been particularly effective. It doesn't change attitudes on average across these studies. Sometimes you just get no effect. Sometimes you even get a backfire effect. Sometimes you get polarization. But there's really not been a study where they've provided people this kind of risk-benefit information and had a really significant impact on people's attitudes. So that made it, yeah.
Hi, sorry, this question's coming a little bit late, but I'm trying to track the Q&A before we get too far away from the cross-cultural differences. Can you just say a few words about why you studied those countries and what you think might be going on with differences between France and Germany and the US?
Yes, yeah, so the main reason we thought this comparison was theoretically interesting was based on past work. We know that Europeans are more opposed, but past work has also suggested that they're less moralizing about that opposition. And so we thought, you know, there's really these dueling predictions about how much moralization should we find, right? It could have been the case, I think it was a live hypothesis, that we would have found a lot of what we call, you know, contingent opposition, non-absolutist opposition. People who say like, well, I think it's bad, but I'm willing to change my mind, given a different balance of risks and benefits. So really, primarily, we wanted to test that from a theoretical perspective. And then, you know, on a more practical level, you know, this does, as we'll see, have implications for what kind of information people find convincing. So knowing the percentage of the population who agrees with this, who says, hey, my opposition is primarily moral, has implications for how might you reach those folks if you want to try and change attitudes. Any more questions before I move on? No? Okay, great, moving on. Okay, so I would say that the takeaway here is that giving people risk-benefit information hasn't proven to be particularly effective. So we thought, you know, our previous work has found that people seem to moralize this. So maybe there's some lessons that we can draw from the moral psych literature. And in particular, we looked at the work on taboo trade-offs from Phil Tetlock, Jen Lerner, and colleagues, who they had been studying these kind of moralized attitudes, and their idea was when people have a moral value, they really resist trading this moral value off against secular considerations, right? So one way that they looked at this was a scenario in which people were asked to consider the decision of a hospital manager who has to make this difficult choice, right? He can save this little boy who needs a liver transplant, little Johnny, or he can let little Johnny die and he can take the $1 million that the transplant would have cost to do other useful things, right? So to hire more staff, to buy better equipment, etc. And Tetlock and colleagues manipulated several things here. Of primary interest is when Robert decides to let little Johnny die and to save the money for other things, people are outraged, right? They think it's absolutely the wrong decision. They're angry and upset. They want him fired, et cetera. So they really react strongly against trading off the sacred value of a human life against these secular concerns of like, hey, you know, this money could actually like be helpful in other ways, right? And Tetlock and colleagues contrasted this with a tragic trade-off. So they gave different people a different scenario in which the hospital director had to choose between saving one of two children, and there was only enough money to cover the treatment for one of these two children. And for our purposes here, the main takeaway is this didn't evoke the same levels of reactance, of outrage, and so on, right? So here people are like, okay, well, difficult decisions have to be made, right? The way that Tetlock and colleagues interpret this, which I think is right, is in this case, you have two kind of sacred values. You have a life versus a life. And that's a tragic decision to be sure, but not one it's morally outrageous to contemplate. Whereas when you contrast a sacred value versus a secular value and try and make that trade-off, that is outrage inducing. Okay, so we thought maybe in the same way, we could look at this in the domain of GE food. So our idea here was, well, you know, when you give people this risk-benefit information, they may be interpreting this as like kind of a secular argument on a moralized issue, right? You know, don't tell me about your calculations about costs and benefits. This is about something more than that, right? This is about my moral beliefs. But maybe if we give them a competing moral value to consider, maybe that would be more effective at shifting them. So that's what we did. We looked at a number of arguments around what we call moral countering, tapping what we call moral countering. And typically these emphasized benefits to the world's poorest. So people who are suffering from malnutrition in developing countries. And the arguments that we gave people, which were, you know, a paragraph or two, pointed out how GE Foods could help the world's poorest, right? We thought, okay, well, this maybe is posing an opposition between their presumed moral objections to GE and their valuing of human life. So it's a moral value versus a moral value. Maybe this will be more effective at shifting people. And we contrasted those moral countering interventions against a number of other interventions that we thought might be effective. So we did this across many studies. I think this is 7 studies total. This is Americans only. These are all moral absolutist opponents assessed using the measure that I showed you earlier. This is about 2,700 people overall. So I'm showing you meta-analytic estimates of the effects here, and the error bars I'm going to show you are 95% confidence interval. So here are the interventions that we tested, and this was just based on our findings in pilot work, our theorizing, and so on. So first of all, there's these 2 intuitions that we thought might be important in people's attitudes. The first has to do with playing God, so intervening, humans intervening in something that's God's domain, namely the creation of life. So these interventions drew on biblical sources to make an argument that humans are stewards to whom God has granted dominion over the earth, and that includes genetic engineering. Our second intervention focused on naturalness because, you know, we thought that that intuition played a big role there. So that intervention discussed gene editing that can happen in nature. So actually in nature, organisms are swapping strings of DNA back and forth between each other all the time. CRISPR, the gene editing system you might have heard of, actually originated in bacteria. So this is actually something that's more common than people think, right? We thought maybe if we point that out, that makes genetic engineering seem more natural. Safety, just discussed the scientific consensus that GE food is safe as conventional food for human consumption. And then finally, the moral countering interventions, as I've discussed, they talked about how GE food can help the world's poorest and help save lives through better nutrition and greater food availability. So what we did is we measured people's moral absolutism at the beginning of the study. We exposed them to one of these interventions, and then we had them complete the moral absolutism measure again at the end, telling them, you know, we know you did this already. It's fine for you to give the same answer. If you want to change your answer, feel free, right? Okay, so we're seeing here just the percentage of absolutists who are changing their minds. The playing God intervention was the least successful. Here we got 9% of absolutists who are changing their minds. The naturalness and the safety interventions were about equally effective. And keep in mind, this is, the safety is sort of kind of the state of the art of what people think you should do, you know, tell people about the scientific consensus about risks. So here we're getting some change, right? It's non-zero. It's above chance, but it's not particularly impressive. And the moral countering intervention was by far the most effective, right? So one more thing I want to show you is we did have a control condition where we just don't give them an intervention at all. And this is because just due to, you know, response error, people might be coded as absolutist at time 1, but then they click the wrong button or something, they're coded as non-absolutist at time 2. And in fact, like, we do get some people who just seem to be like misclicking or extremely uncertain about their views. It's about 4%. I've put that red line there to show you. So this is what you would expect if the interventions did absolutely nothing, right? So all of them do something, but the moral countering intervention seems to be by far the most effective.
Yeah, well,
okay.
I've got a question about this. So yeah, this is super interesting, and the link to the taboo trade-offs is quite provocative. I guess the question I have is, why not conceive of the moral counter as itself a kind of benefit? And this is a kind of consequentialist analysis. It just happens that it's a moral benefit. I mean, it seems like you could interpret this through a kind of, you know, reasoned lens rather than this being an unreasoned sort of process.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I think that's a great point. It can be tough to differentiate those. And one thing that I was particularly worried about was a variant of that. Was, you know, maybe this is just like a really good argument, right? Maybe because saving lives of people who are desperately poor really is, I mean, like, this is what Peter Singer's all about, right? This is, in consequentialist terms, a huge benefit. So one thing we did is we also asked supporters to say, which of these arguments do you find most compelling? And they found the moral countering argument a little bit more compelling, but they found the risk argument, these foods are perfectly safe, to be nearly as compelling, right? So we see that when we give them separate rating scales for each of them. We see that when we make them choose which do you think is the most compelling on a single scale. So the supporters, they do differentiate slightly in favor of the moral countering argument, but not much. So it's not the case that this is just an argument that's like hands down better, more convincing to everybody, right? It seems to be particularly convincing to those moral opponents. So I think that speaks a little bit against the idea that, like, this is just a pure consequentialist calculation that everybody is making in the same way. That said, you know, I don't want to be too dogmatic about saying, like, well, there's no consequentialism going on at all here, right? And I think the difficulty with this stuff always is that these things sort of shade into each other, right? So I think that's a fair point and definitely something to keep in mind. And I would just say, you know, the fact that it's particularly compelling to the absolutist opponents sort of says to me, well, there's something special going on for those folks with this argument in particular.
Cool. Thanks. Yep.
Yoel, I have a question, and I wanted to flag something that's been coming up in the chat. Just to start with my question, first, I think it's super interesting that you're able to push this around at all. Another thing that came up is that I wonder if the existence of the counterfactual of conventional farming makes these positions seem more tenable or appealing. So what do you think would happen if you presented a scenario where the world is running out of food, we have no other options? What do you think? From an extreme sacred or protected values standpoint, people should allegedly be willing to face hunger to not eat them. What do you think would happen?
Right. Yeah. So we haven't tried that. My intuition would be that we would get a lot of people saying, "Oh, never mind. In that case, it's okay." Right. So we don't think that people take it literally to the degree that they're going to be willing to tell us, "I would rather let everybody on Earth starve."
Right.
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 You can sort of see this along the lines of what Jeff was saying, right? Like this is like maybe a really powerful welfare argument because the alternative is like mass
Mm-hmm.
death. And you see this too in the work that John Barron did around protected values,
Right.
which is where this measure obviously comes from, is that you start pushing people on like, okay, well, what if the consequence of sticking to this is that millions die? And then people are like, well, actually, I'm willing to rethink this, right? So like, it's very consistent with the idea of thinking of this as like, people are stating a moral belief, but you also can't 100% take them literally at their word as like under no circumstances, right? They're using that language in order to signal, hey, this is something morally important to me.
Yeah, it could be interesting to check out how people would respond to that that hypothetical. And the theme from the chat that's been coming up is, what exactly are people opposed to with genetic modification? Is it something about the process, so the opaqueness of the scientific process, or the outcome that you're fundamentally changing plants or animals?
Yeah. That's a great question. So we were super interested in this process question, and we thought, based on our reading of things that opponents say, also based on some pilot work, that feelings of unnaturalness were really important here, and that feelings of playing God were really important here, and that's why we had those two interventions. And as you can see, they weren't particularly effective. Now, to me, that's not like entirely conclusive at saying, well, that's not what people are thinking, because it may be that when you directly argue against the intuitive basis for somebody's moral beliefs, that's not going to work very well, right? So by analogy, if you imagine in the hospital director scenario, you say like, well, let me try and convince you that human life actually isn't sacred, right? People are going to be like, F you, basically. And it may be that some of that reactance was what we were getting here. So I still believe that particularly these beliefs about unnaturalness are playing a big role here. Now, that also is a bit of a opaque concept here, right? So people tell you it's unnatural. Well, what do they mean by that? I just recently saw a paper that I think is really informative about this, where what they did is they gave people sort of a mini course about genetic engineering over the course of several weeks. And they saw that as a result of that mini course, people's attitudes about GE food did become significantly more positive. Now, it wasn't a huge effect. We're talking about like half a scale point, maybe scale point max. But still, they did significantly move those folks who had that mini course in a more pro-GE direction. So that's kind of an exception to the research I showed you earlier, where I said like, well, providing people information doesn't do much. Definitely, I would say providing risk and benefit information, like it's, we see some effect of it here, but it's not particularly efficacious. But, giving people a course about the science behind it is a little bit different, right? It's not authority say, it's sort of demystifying the process, right? And that gets to this, I guess, word that you used of opaqueness, that may be tied up with this feeling of it's unnatural, right? So if you're thinking about what repulses you about it, it might be this feeling that people are doing something kind of mysterious and unnatural and wrong. And part of what fuels that belief is that you don't really have a good understanding of how this stuff actually works. It just seems like this black box of badness. And if you look at it that way, you're likely to think, oh, no, just stop.
Great, thank you. I'm doing a thumbs up, but you can't see it.
I cannot see it, but thank you for the verbal thumbs up. Okay, so
just a friendly 7-minute warning.
Yeah, so I wonder, does it make sense for me to go on to the second half, which is like, I don't know how much of this I'm actually going to be able to get to, maybe like a first little bit, or does it make sense for us to just do the last 7 minutes on more Q&A if there's more questions? What do you guys think?
I see some interesting questions, but up to you. But
Okay, I think rather than rushing through the second half, which if anybody's interested, email me for the working paper. I'm happy to share. Basically what we do in the second half is we look at people's attitudes across a whole range of technologies and see how do they cohere, what predicts them. But it's a little bit of an elaborate setup, and like I don't think we're going to quite get there in the 7 minutes. So maybe we just do a little more discussion for the last now 6 minutes.
Yeah, well, one question that has come up a couple of times in the chat is that this idea that people might be reasonably okay with genetic engineering or modification as it stands right now, but they have this lingering anxiety that it's going to encroach upon more areas and potentially be used on humans. So I guess it's a slippery slope type argument. So I guess the question there would just be, what do you think about that, and have you done anything that might speak to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That is something that people do have concerns about. This is something that we ask about in other research, and it is something where people say like, well, I definitely don't like that and I'm worried about it. Do they make the connection to GE food? Here, I'm not, this isn't my own work, but there has been research that just asks people, what concerns you most about this, right? What do you worry about? Either open-ended or rating. And there, people overwhelmingly say current risks to human health, right? They think this stuff is dangerous. And I don't recall that slippery slope is really mentioned much or rated highly by respondents as kind of a primary reason for their opposition. So I don't think that that answer is dispositive, but it's at least suggestive that this isn't like top of mind for people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, maybe you could say just a few words about the other technology without giving it all. Just tell us a little bit about the other technologies that are related that you've been exploring.
Yeah, okay. Let me skip ahead a tiny bit here in the 4 minutes that I have left and show you what we've done. So just to set this up a tiny bit, the way we do this is we give people a list of different technologies, and we ask them to rate what they think of them, right? So we think of these items that people see here, these are the actual items, as tapping the same kind of underlying latent variable, do they like it or not? And in fact, these really correlate well with each other, right? So we create for each technology then a composite score that's just like how much do people like it? And you'll notice that higher scores here are worse. So they're always going to be scaled in that way. And then for each participant, we have a composite score, right, across different technologies. So this participant's composite for vaccinations, for GE plants, for cloning humans, et cetera. And then we make a new data set that just has participant by technology composites, right, where each row is a participant, each column is a technology. Then we just do a factor analysis on these ratings. What this tells us is, how do these hang together, right? So if I like or dislike this, what else do I like or dislike? We've done, we have a number of studies now where we've sort of varied the list of technologies. We've done exploratory factor analysis. We've done confirmatory ones. And they always come out roughly the same to these 3 factors. So I'm just showing some representative technologies here. So the first cluster has, well, the practice that Jeff just brought up, a genetic engineering of humans, embryo selection, cryogenics, so stuff around life creation and life extension, I would say. Second cluster has stuff that most people are generally okay with, that's in common use. And the third cluster is interesting. It has stuff to do with like things that you eat, so high fructose corn syrup. RBST is a hormone that's sometimes given to cows that arguably, some people think gets into milk, artificial sweeteners, and so on. GE crops go there as well. But then also things that are seen as environmentally dangerous or contaminating, so fracking or nuclear energy. And so what we've done in this work is we've tried to come up with, what are these clusters? What do they mean? What are the intuitions that they're drawing on? So we call the first cluster here playing God. The second cluster here, mainstream, because these are things that people typically like. And the third cluster we call contaminating, because we think that attitudes here draw on intuitions about contamination of the self or contamination of the natural world. So what we've done in this work is to try and look at, okay, well, what are the correlates of being more positive or negative towards technologies on these different clusters, right? So what can we say about people who are really negative towards the mainstream technologies, right? What can we say about the people who are really negative towards the contaminating technologies and so on? So we're really trying to build a profile here of people who feel different ways about these technologies. And so I'm nearly out of time, so I can't show you all of that, but essentially we get these consistent relationships with the individual differences that kind of you might expect given this interpretation of these kind of clusters of technologies, right? So the playing God factor, for example, there's a scale called aversion to playing God, and that does indeed correlate specifically with negativity towards technologies on that cluster. If we look at religious fundamentalism, here again we see the strongest correlation with attitudes towards the playing God technology. So the idea is that we can differentiate, what are the intuitions that people are drawing on when they're coming up with their attitudes towards these different technologies. And if anybody would like to know more, I'm happy to share the working paper on that.
Okay, so why don't we wrap up there? Yoel, thanks so much for being our guinea pig on this. Really, really appreciate it. Sorry, everyone, for the technological problems that we had at the outset. We are obviously going to get better at this over time. At least we're not going to get worse at it over time. So really appreciate all of you guys hanging in with us. Also, if you have some suggestions for ways to improve it, actually just email Yuri. Let him deal with that. But he can try to put them all together, and we can try to figure it out. But really appreciate it. The panelists, you guys were awesome. Thank you guys so much for doing this weird thing and for asking such good questions. And thanks to everyone also who asked lots of good questions over the chat, including some that we weren't able to get to, but we'll pass those along to Yoel. So thanks guys so much, and looking forward to doing this more in the future. Okay, you guys take care.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for the invite, you guys. Thanks to the panelists, and thanks to all the invisible people in the audience for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.